Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is something strange and quietly wonderful about sitting down and asking what is, on the surface, a completely ridiculous question. Not ridiculous in a dismissive way, ridiculous in the way that the best questions often are, the kind that sound almost like a joke until you pull on the thread and discover it goes all the way down to the bedrock of a universe's philosophy. What happens when an orc dies and doesn't believe it? Take a moment with that. Actually sit with it, because the more you think about it, the more layers it reveals. It isn't just a question about death. It isn't even primarily a question about orcs. It's a question about the relationship between belief and reality, about the strange and deeply unsettling way that Warhammer 40,000 is constructed at its most fundamental level, a universe where, in a very real and documented sense, what you believe shapes what is true. And orcs, of all the species in the 41st millennium, are the ones who have turned that principle into something almost transcendent. They are, in the truest sense, a species defined entirely by the act of believing. Their technology works because they believe it does. Their weapons fire because the orcs holding them expect them to. Their gods, the twin divine fists of Gork and Mork, exist in the warp as genuine, measurable, terrifying entities because billions and billions of orcs have believed in them so completely and for so long that the belief itself became solid, became real, became the kind of thing that can punch other gods in the face. So when we ask what happens when an orc dies and doesn't believe it, but we're essentially asking, in a universe where belief has weight and substance, where faith bends the laws of physics, what happens when one of the most stubbornly, gloriously, catastrophically believing creatures in existence refuses to accept the signal that it should stop? And the answer, when you dig it out of the lore, out of the biology, out of the strange warp-touch metaphysics of the setting, the answer is extraordinary. But before we get there, we need to build a foundation. We need to understand what an orc actually is. Not just in the simple sense of big green fighter with a shooter and a chopper. We need to understand what they are on a biological level, on a spiritual level, on a metaphysical level. Because without that foundation, the rest of it doesn't carry the weight it deserves. So come and settle in. There is no rushing this story. This is the kind of lore that rewards patience, the kind that builds slowly and arrives somewhere completely unexpected. Get comfortable, keep the lights low, and let's begin at the very beginning, at the beginning of the orcs themselves. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is, at its core, a place where nothing is simple and very little is merciful. It is a setting that has been running for decades, layering fiction upon fiction, lore upon lore, until it has accumulated something that feels less like a game setting and more like an actual mythology. A mythology with the same kind of internal contradictions, regional variations, and strange resonances that real mythologies have. And like all great mythologies, it contains creatures that, when you examine them closely, should turn out to be far more philosophically interesting than their surface appearance suggests. The orcs are perhaps the greatest example of this. On the surface, they appear to be comic relief. Big, dumb, loud, violent, obsessed with fighting for its own sake. They speak in a patois that sounds like someone ran every English word through a blender. They paint their vehicles in garish colours. They argue about which of their identical gods is better. They treat their own deaths with the same casual indifference they show everyone else's. But underneath that surface is something remarkable. Something that the Eldar, one of the oldest and most sophisticated species in the setting, have recognized. There is a quote that floats around the community, attributed to an Eldar, that goes something like this: "The orcs are the pinnacle of creation." As for them, the great struggle is already won. They exist in a society without stress, without existential crisis, without the crushing weight of purpose that destroys more sensitive species. And we, the Eldar, who have failed so thoroughly in our own grand purpose, who are we to judge them? That's a remarkable thing for an Eldar to say, and it points at something worth exploring. The orcs are not simple. They just appear that way. Their simplicity is, in fact, a kind of mastery, and nowhere is this more apparent than in how they handle the one thing that terrifies every other species in the galaxy: death. Before we can talk about what happens when an orc dies and refuses to believe it, we need to understand the full, extraordinary truth of what an orc actually is. And that means starting with the biology. Asum, Section 2. What is an orc, really? The living war machine. More than 60 million years ago, which is a span of time so vast it is essentially meaningless to human minds. A duration that makes all of recorded human history look like a single afternoon. There existed in this galaxy a species known as the Old Ones. They were ancient beyond measure, subtle beyond comprehension, and they were at war. A war not just for territory or resources, but for the fundamental soul of the galaxy itself, against an enemy that had stripped itself of emotion and desire and become something cold and implacable and endless. The Necrons and their Aetan masters, the great devouring silence against which all warmth and life stood in opposition. The Old Ones, recognizing that they needed weapons, living weapons. Oh, weapons that could think and adapt and feel, and more importantly, fight with a ferocity that cold immortal metal constructs could never match. Engineered species for the purpose. They made the Eldari, psychic and quick and brilliant. They made others, and they made the Krork. The Krork were the soldiers. They were built for war, the way a sword is built for cutting. Every part of their design oriented toward that single purpose. Where the Eldari were subtle instruments, the Krork were blunt ones. They were massive, standing 12 meters tall in their prime, encased in exo-armor that even the most advanced Mechanicus artifice of the 41st Millennium would struggle to replicate. They were the infantry of a god, essentially, a bioengineered race of living tanks designed to be pointed at the enemy and trust to do the rest. Over 60 million years, through the collapse of the war in heaven, the extinction of the Old Ones, the long silence of the Necron slumber, the rise and fall of the Eldari, the birth of chaos, the emergence of humanity. Through all of that, the Krork declined. Without their makers to guide them, without wars of sufficient scale to sustain them at their peak, they slowly devolved. The ancient 12-meter warriors became the orcs we know today, typically around 7 to 8 feet tall when fully grown, which is already enormous by most species standards, and capable of growing considerably larger, given enough time and enough fighting. But the engineering of the Old Ones doesn't simply vanish because the creatures they built have shrunk. The bones of the Krork's design are still there, are woven into every orc that grows from a spore and stumbles blinking into the world with an instinct for violence and a working knowledge of how to put a gun together, despite never having been taught. Now, the orc body. Let's spend real time here, because understanding the body is the key to understanding what happens at and after death. At the most fundamental level, an orc is a symbiosis. It is simultaneously an animal and a fungus, two distinct biological systems woven together so completely that neither can properly exist without the other. The animal side provides the aggressive, pack-hunting, combat-oriented drives. The fungal side does something even more extraordinary. It replaces or supplements almost every complex organ system that other species rely on to survive. Humans, for example, have livers, kidneys, a pancreas, or an immune system, a complex hormonal network. These are delicate, intricate systems that can be disrupted in dozens of ways that lead to death. The orc's fungal biology renders most of these unnecessary. The fungus fills the body cavity with what can only be described as a thick biological soup, a medium that simultaneously processes nutrients, manages waste, fights infection with a ferocity that makes conventional immune systems look timid, and performs a dozen other functions that in other species require entire dedicated organs. The result is a creature with a dramatically reduced number of potential fatal injury points. You cannot give an orc liver failure. You cannot cause an orc's immune system to turn on itself. The systems that could fail simply aren't there in the same form. What's left is robust, redundant, and extraordinarily difficult to destroy. The bones are thick and dense, laced with a spongy fungal matter at their cores instead of the more fragile marrow of human bones. The muscles are extraordinarily developed, dense, responsive, and powerful in ways that make even space marine physiology look modest by comparison. The skin is tough and leathery, scarred green hide that has been compared to low-grade ceramite in terms of its ability to absorb minor impacts. The brain is large, structurally similar to those of humans or Eldar in overall organization, but with a fascinating twist discovered during autopsies carried out by Adeptus Mechanicus xenobiologists during the War of the Beast in the 32nd millennium. The regions responsible for problem-solving in humans located in the frontal lobes, should the most evolutionarily recent part of the brain, are in orcs found much deeper in the brain structure, in regions that develop far earlier in evolutionary terms. This seems to indicate something profound about orc cognition. Their problem-solving isn't a learned or cultured skill. It's primal. It's instinctive. It's as natural to them as breathing. This is why orc mechboys can build functional vehicles and weapons from scrap without formal training, without apprenticeship, without schools. The knowledge is in their genes, literally, encoded by the old ones and passed down through the fungal spore cycle, generation after generation, for 60 million years. An orc mechboy picks up a wrench for the first time and already knows, at some deep instinctive level, what it's for. I think there's another remarkable feature of orc biology that deserves attention here, and that's the green. Orcs are green, obviously, famously green, and for a long time this was simply accepted as a visual design feature. But the xenobiologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus discovered something fascinating when they began seriously studying orc blood. It has a high chlorophyll content, trace elements of carbon and copper. The blood is greenish, and the skin is green, and there is a reason for both. Orcs can photosynthesize. Not entirely. They still consume food, primarily the small squig organisms that form part of the orcoid ecosystem, but they can draw nutritional energy directly from sunlight. It reduces their supply lines to essentially nothing. An orc army needs ammunition and fuel. It does not truly need food in the traditional sense, and at least not in quantities that would constrain its movements the way food supply constrains a human army. Everything about this creature, from its bones to its blood to its skin to its brain structure, has been engineered for one purpose: warfare. Not just surviving warfare, but thriving in it. Not just enduring injury, but growing stronger from it. This is the organism we are talking about when we ask what happens when it dies. And here is where it starts to get interesting. Section 3. The Gestalt Field. When belief becomes reality. Before we talk about orc death, we have to talk about what is perhaps the most extraordinary fact about the orc species. The one that elevates them from interesting biology to genuine metaphysical phenomenon. Every orc is to a small degree psychic. Not in the dramatic sense. Orcs don't read minds. They don't hurl fireballs on command. They don't have the kind of focused individual psychic ability that the Eldari or human psykers possess. In fact, the old ones deliberately engineered them so that they would lack individual psychic power. The Eldari were created with that kind of individual psychic gift, and the old ones saw the risks of it clearly enough to ensure their soldiers didn't carry the same vulnerability. But they didn't make the orcs psychically inert either. Instead, they did something considerably more interesting. They gave the orcs a collective ability, a gestalt field. Every orc generates a faint psychic emission. This emission, on its own, is barely detectable, barely significant. But orcs gather in enormous numbers. That is their nature and their purpose. And when they gather, their individual faint emissions combine and reinforce each other, growing exponentially rather than simply additively. The more orcs in a given place, the more powerfully their combined field manifests. And at sufficient numbers, this field begins to do something that should be impossible. It bends reality. The Adeptus Mechanicus Those great skeptics and empiricists of the Imperium have studied this and come to a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. Orc technology works, in part, because orcs believe it will. Not entirely. There is genuine engineering skill at work, the encoded knowledge of the old ones expressing itself through generations of mech boys. But the belief component is real and measurable. An orc weapon that misfires consistently in human hands will function reliably when an orc picks it up. Not because the weapon changed, but because the orc's expectation of function, supported by the low-grade psychic field, creates a quantum probability effect that nudges outcomes toward the expected result. The famous example, the one everyone cites, is the paint. Orcs believe that red vehicles go faster. This is a statement that should be laughable. The color of paint has no mechanical effect on engine performance, and anyone with even a basic understanding of physics knows this. And yet, orc vehicles painted red measurably perform better than orc vehicles that are not, because enough orcs believe it strongly enough, and their collective belief has genuine physical weight in a universe where the warp, that psychic mirror of material reality, is constantly interacting with the physical world. Yellow makes explosions bigger, blue makes the wearer luckier, red goes faster. These are not orc superstitions. In the most literal sense, they are orc facts, true facts, facts that imperial xenobiologists have had to painfully accept and document because the evidence is undeniable. Now consider the implications of this. If enough orcs believing something strongly enough can make a vehicle move faster, can make explosions larger, can make ramshackle piles of scrap function as sophisticated weapons, what else can it do? The orc gods, Gork and Mork, are the most obvious example. They exist, not as metaphors, not as psychological constructs, or not as mere cultural totems. They exist in the warp as genuine entities, as powerful as or possibly more powerful than the Chaos Gods themselves, according to some lore sources. And why do they exist? Because the orcs believe in them. Because billions upon billions of orcs, for tens of millions of years, have poured their psychic conviction into these two figures. Brutal and cunning, cunning and brutal, until that conviction crystallized into something that is genuinely divine. Gork hits you even harder when you see him coming. Mork hits you when you don't. And both of them are completely real in a way that matters, in a way that affects the physical universe, because the belief in them is real and has been sustained at enormous scale for an almost incomprehensible span of time. This is the context you need to understand orc death. Because when we ask what happens when an orc dies and doesn't believe it, we are asking what happens when one of these creatures, a creature whose biology is designed to survive, a creature whose collective psychic field bends reality according to belief, encounters death and refuses to acknowledge it. The field, remember, doesn't just affect technology. It affects everything. It is the orc's passive relationship with reality itself, and an orc, fundamentally, does not believe in losing. Section 4. The moment of death, and why it doesn't fully stick. Here is what we know about orc physiology in the moment that a killing blow lands. First, the pain response. Orcs feel surprisingly little pain, even from grievous wounds. This is not bravado. It is not cultural conditioning. Sure, it is biology. The fungal components of their nervous systems simply don't register pain signals with anywhere near the intensity that human neurology does. An orc that has taken a bolt round through the shoulder will not instinctively flinch away the way a human would. The pain doesn't command its attention the way it would command ours. The wound is a tactical problem, not an overwhelming sensory experience. This means that orcs continue fighting through injuries that would cause complete functional shutdown in any other species purely through the mechanism of pain. They stay in the fight, they keep moving, they keep attacking. The wound might slow them fractionally, might alter their balance or reduce the strength in a damaged limb, but the signal that screams at a human to stop, to protect itself, to prioritize survival over aggression, that signal is dramatically muted in an orc. Second, the regenerative capacity. Orc biology heals at a rate that defies easy comparison. The xenobiologist Genitor Aurelius Thos, working in his personal notes on orc physiology, recorded observations of orcs suffering what he clinically designated as fatal wounds in the midst of heavy fighting, and then being observed again days later, larger and stronger than they had been before the injury, with no visible evidence of the wound beyond some largely superficial scarring. The regenerative process driven by that fungal biology is simply that aggressive. Reports from battlefield observers across centuries of Imperial conflict with the orcs document individual greenskins continuing to fight after sustaining injuries that should have been instantly incapacitating. Orcs recorded as clinically dead, no measurable heartbeat, no brain activity detectable by available instrumentation, continuing to swing their weapons for a short time afterward. This is not metaphor. This is documented Imperial military observation. There are accounts of orcs being hacked to pieces in combat and being subsequently stitched back together by a painboy, one of the orc subspecialty fighters, whose role corresponds roughly to a combat medic, though the comparison undersells both how horrifying and how effective their methods are, and of those orcs recovering fully. An orc that has been cut in half is not, within the orc understanding, necessarily a dead orc. It is an orc that needs to be stitched back together. There is even confirmed documentation of an orc's severed head remaining alive for some period after separation from the body, not moving, not capable of combat in that state, but alive, still broadcasting the faint psychic signal, still, in some biological sense, not dead. And head reattachment operations are documented as a standard part of a painboy's repertoire. Dramatic, certainly, controversial as a medical technique by most metrics, but functional with a frequency that would be impossible in human medicine. So what does it actually take to definitively kill an orc? The most commonly cited answer in Imperial military doctrine is reduction to ash. Burning the body completely appears to reliably end the threat, or not just from the biological regeneration perspective, but from the ecological one, which we will discuss shortly. Decapitation has been suggested as reliable in some sources, though Khazkul Thraka's famous decapitation at the hands of Space Wolf Lord Ragnar Blackmane and subsequent survival somewhat undermines confidence in that approach. The enormous volume of trauma required to overwhelm the regenerative capacity seems to be the other reliable vector, but even that involves destruction at a scale beyond what most weapons encounters produce. In practical terms, on an actual battlefield, an orc that has been shot once, or stabbed once, or struck once, by even a powerful blow, is not dead. It is annoyed. It might be briefly slowed, but it absolutely does not believe it is dead. And as we will explore, well, that belief has consequences. There is something philosophically interesting in the gap between what Imperial soldiers experience when they fight orcs, and what the orcs themselves experience in the same moments. For an Imperial guardsman, a wound is a moment of crisis, a disruption, a potential ending. For an orc, a wound in the middle of a fight is background noise, its texture. It might even be, in some orky way, enjoyable, because it means the fight is good, the enemy is strong, and this is the kind of proper scrap that makes the blood pump and the adrenaline flow. The orc's default psychological state is not fear, it's not anxiety, it's not self-preservation, it is enthusiasm for the immediate situation, whatever that situation is. And the immediate situation, for an orc in combat, is always a good one. Because the immediate situation is combat, and combat is the only thing orcs are absolutely certain they were made for. A creature in that psychological state, with that biology, does not experience the ordinary narrative of dying. There is no moment of recognition, no sudden awareness that this is the end, no shift in consciousness towards the quiet acceptance of death. The orc simply keeps going until the body cannot support it, and even then, the body argues about it. Section 5. The Great Death Explosion, Spores and the Undying Legacy. But here is where the story of orc death takes its most extraordinary turn. Here is where the sheer, relentless, almost offensive ingenuity of the Old One's engineering becomes most apparent. Because while an individual orc's death might be debatable, messy, contested, and subject to revision by a sufficiently determined painboy, the death of an orc population is something that has never, in 60 million years of galactic history, truly happened. Not even once. The orcs have never gone extinct. They have come close to nothing resembling it. And the reason for this is the spore. Throughout its life, an orc continuously releases microscopic fungal spores into its environment. Not dramatically, not visibly. This is a passive biological process, the orcoid equivalent of shedding skin cells, continuous and unconscious. These spores drift on air currents, settle into soil, burrow into crevices, find their way into the dark and nutrient-rich places of any world where orcs have walked. Under normal circumstances, with a healthy orc population present, these spores don't do much. So the ecological niche for new orcoid growth is already occupied. The existing population is stable, the ecosystem maintained by the snotlings and Gretchen that form the supporting infrastructure of any orc community. The spores sit dormant, waiting, but then an orc dies. At the moment of death, the actual, final, this is really it moment, an orc doesn't quietly stop. It erupts. The body, in its final biological act, releases an enormous burst of spores into the surrounding environment. This is not metaphorical. It is not small. It is a massive, dramatic expulsion of fungal material, a final reproductive event on a scale that dwarfs the passive spore release of its entire lifetime. A single orc death seeds an area with an extraordinary quantity of genetic material. Those spores travel. They ride the wind for miles, as potentially dozens of miles in favorable atmospheric conditions. They survive in vacuum. They have been found centuries after a battle, still viable, still carrying the full genetic potential to restart the orcoid life cycle from scratch. The orc death that spawned them might have happened 100 years ago, on a world that was declared cleansed, on a planet whose defenders celebrated their victory and declared the Green Menace defeated. And the spores are still there, waiting quietly in the dark. The life cycle that begins from those spores is slow at first. The fungal structures grow underground, out of sight, feeding on whatever organic material is available. In the first stages of growth, they produce squigs, small, simple, biting creatures that are the basic unit of orcoid life, the foundation of the ecosystem. The squigs graze on the fungal growth, spread the spores further, fertilize the soil. Then snotlings emerge, small, quick, clever enough to tend the fungal gardens and build rudimentary structures. Then Gretchen, who build the settlements and provide the labor. And finally, from the most advanced fungal growth structures, orc boys begin to emerge, fully formed, genetically encoded with the knowledge they need to fight and function, ready for war. This process takes years, sometimes decades, but it is reliable. It is self-sustaining. It requires no oversight, no seed population, no surviving orc to tend it. The spores do everything. A single orc death, on a world far from any other orc presence, has begun this process. When a world that thought itself clear has woken up 30 years later to find a feral orc tribe emerging from the wilderness with an aggression that seems to come from nowhere. The only reliable way to ensure this doesn't happen, the only way that Imperial doctrine has ever confirmed actually works, is exterminatus, the total sterilization of a planetary surface by orbital bombardment of sufficient intensity to destroy all organic material. Everything else falls short. Conventional military victory over an orc invasion, no matter how complete, leaves spores behind. Leave spores behind, and the world will eventually have orcs again. It might take decades, it might take a century, but the orcs will return, because the spores remember what they're supposed to grow into. There is something in this that is almost beautiful in its efficiency. The Old Ones built a species that was not just designed to fight, but designed to be effectively impossible to eradicate short of planetary sterilization. Every death feeds the next generation. Every fallen orc contributes its genetic material to the next wave. The more you kill, the more you are in fact seeding the next invasion. This is what makes the orcs arguably the most successful species in the galaxy. They don't number in the billions because they're somehow safe or protected. They number in the trillions because death has never had the expected consequences for them. They have been fighting and dying for 60 million years, and every death has fed the next growth, and the growth has fed the next horde, and the horde has fed the next war, and they have never, not once, cared. But the spore cycle is the biological answer to what happens when an orc dies. It's the physical legacy, the material continuity. It is not the whole answer to our question, because our question wasn't just about the body. Our question was about what happens to an orc that doesn't believe it died. And for that, we need to talk about what orcs believe happens after death. Section 6. The Soul and the Great Green. What orcs actually believe. There is a region in the warp that is not well documented in Imperial sources. The Imperium's understanding of the warp is extensive when it comes to chaos, because chaos is the enemy and the threat that the Imperium cannot afford to ignore. The Chaos Gods have been studied, their domains mapped as well as anyone can map something that defies geography. Their daemonic servants catalogued with the obsessive thoroughness of a civilization that knows its enemies. But the orcs are not the Imperium's primary metaphysical concern, and so the spiritual geography of the orc presence in the warp is less thoroughly documented. What we know comes from fragments, from captured orc shamans called Weird Boys, from the reports of inquisitors who survived encounters with massive orc gatherings, from the decoded remnants of orc mythology preserved by a specialized class of orc called Runthards. What that fragmentary evidence suggests is this. There is a place in the warp that orcs call the Great Green. The Great Green is, in orc belief, where Gork and Mork dwell. It is described as a spiritual domain, as a region of the Imperium that the collective orc psychic field has shaped over 60 million years into something corresponding to an orc afterlife. It is, in the same way that Gork and Mork themselves are real, genuinely, measurably real as warp entities, potentially an actual place. A domain of collective orc spiritual energy that has accumulated sufficient density to maintain itself as a distinct region of the Imperium. When an orc dies, according to orc belief, its spirit goes to the Great Green. There it waits in the presence of Gork and Mork, in the company of every orc that died before it, in a place that presumably involves an enormous amount of fighting, because this is, after all, orc heaven. And when the gods decide that a particular orc spirit has proven itself sufficient, when it has pleased Gork and Mork with the quality of its battle conduct, the enthusiasm of its violence, the sheer orkiness of its approach to existence, the gods reincarnate it, send it back into a new orc body, give it another go. Now here is where this becomes truly interesting in the context of our question. The soul of an orc, in this framework, is not a passive thing. It is not the fragile, trembling human soul that must be protected from the darkness of the warp by faith or psychic shielding or the burning vigilance of a god. The orc soul is robust in the same way the orc body is robust. It is a battered, opinionated, pugnacious piece of spiritual matter that has been shaped by 60 million years of collective orc existence into something that doesn't easily dissolve or lose its coherence. Consider what happens to human souls in the warp after death. For most humans, the soul dissipates. It loses its coherence, fragments, merges back into the general background noise of the Imperium. For those who are psychically active, the soul burns brighter and attracts attention. The attention of demons, of chaos entities, of things that would very much like to consume that bright spark. The Eldar have an even worse problem, because their souls are so bright and so attractive that the chaos god Slanesh specifically hunts them, has made an eternal project of consuming every elder soul that enters the warp. The orc soul doesn't have this problem, not because it's protected by faith or sealed in a spirit stone, but because the collective orc psychic field, the same field that makes orc technology function, the same field that sustains Gork and Mork, provides an ambient protection. The individual orc spirit, upon death, doesn't wander alone through the howling dark of the warp. It moves into the collective, into the great green, into the warm and violent and thunderously noisy presence of its gods and its fellow dead orcs. Chaos cannot easily reach it there. The Chaos gods acknowledge the orc gods as genuine and formidable entities. There is lore suggesting that Khorne and Gork and Mork have clashed in the warp, and that these are battles between comparable powers. The Great Green is not undefended territory, but here is the question that haunts all of this. And that connects directly to the thing we set out to explore. What happens when the soul doesn't get the memo? What happens to an orc spirit that is so thoroughly convinced that it isn't dead, so stubbornly, so characteristically, so orcally certain that it is still in the fight, that it simply refuses to transition to the Great Green? Here the lore becomes fascinating and also, honestly, delightfully uncertain, because the nature of the warp is that belief matters. And we have already established that orc belief has measurable physical consequences. If an orc, in the moment of its death, is so intensely occupied with the current situation, the current fight, the current enemy in front of it, the complete and total certainty that it is winning and is going to keep winning, that it doesn't register the transition of death, well, what does the warp do with that? There is no clean canonical answer, but there are breadcrumbs. There are examples, and there is one story, above all others, that illuminates what happens when orc belief and orc death collide in the most dramatic way imaginable. Section 7, Tusker the Demon Killer, the orc who found a better afterlife. In the year 890 of the 41st millennium, a kill cruiser called the Gorjaw was making its way through the warp when something happened that its crew was entirely unprepared for. A demon got on the ship, not a small one, a massive, multi-headed creature of the Imperium, something that had slipped through whatever psychic wards and fortunate protections had been keeping the orcs' warp travel reasonably survivable up to that point, and it had decided that the crew of the Gorjaw looked interesting, or delicious, or simply available. The creature rampaged through the ship, killing as it went, leaving devastation behind it with the casual efficiency of something that existed largely to destroy. The war boss of the Gorjaw was an orc who called himself Tusker. Not a title exactly, more a self-presentation, a declaration of intent. Tusker heard the chaos erupting in his ship, and rather than treating this as a crisis, he treated it as an opportunity. He armed himself with his power claw, one enormous mechanical fist capable of tearing through armored vehicles, and went to find out what was making that noise. What happened next was described by surviving Gretchen witnesses as colossal. Tusker and the demon met on the Gorjaw's bridge, and the fight was everything an orc dreams a fight could be. The creature was immense, powerful, hostile in the specific and interesting way that only things from the warp can be hostile. And Tusker, to the reported astonishment of his crew, won. He killed the demon, not with firepower, not with overwhelming numbers, but with the power claw and an attitude that seems to have been approximately, "This is the best thing that has ever happened to me." He took the demon's head as a trophy. Now, most beings who had a near-death experience involving a warp creature would probably take away a lesson about caution, about the dangers of the Imperium, about the wisdom of avoiding places where such things could happen. Tusker took away a completely different lesson. He learned that demons existed, and that demons were, by his assessment, the greatest fight possible, bigger, stranger, more dangerous, and more interesting than anything else he had fought up to that point. He wanted more. Tusker gathered every weird boy he could find, every psychic orc whose peculiar sensitivity to the warp might be weaponized for navigational purposes, and he used them to do something that no orc before him had apparently done deliberately. He navigated around the imperial fortifications around Cadia and drove his entire warband into the Eye of Terror. The Eye of Terror is the most notorious region of sustained warp-real space overlap in the galaxy. It is the scar left by the birth of Slaanesh 10,000 years before, a wound in reality through which the warp bleeds continuously into material space. Demon worlds orbit within it. Chaos Space Marines have fortified its interior for 10 millennia. The laws of physics function only as suggestions within its borders, and time itself is unreliable.
Okay, I just want to take a second here and step out the lore for a moment because I think about this stuff a lot. I genuinely believe the orcs are the most misunderstood faction in 40k. Like, most people come to this hobby and they write the greenskins off. Comic relief, right? The loud ones. The joke race. And honestly, that used to be my read too when I first got into 40k. I was way more drawn to the Space Marines, the Eldar, anything with this weight of tragedy behind it. But the more time I've spent with the lore, and I mean really sitting with it, not just skimming the surface, the more I think the orcs might actually be the most philosophically complete species in the entire universe. They are the only ones who are not losing. Everyone else is fighting a battle they are slowly, inevitably losing. The Imperium is rotting from within. The Eldar are a dying ember. And even chaos is ultimately just consumption without direction. But the orcs are thriving. Every death feeds the next generation. Every loss is just a delay. Every defeat is, from their perspective, just a fight that hasn't finished yet. There's something quietly profound about that, and I don't think it gets talked about enough. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
Tusker drove his warband straight into it, looking for a fight. And he found one. Several, in fact. He made his mark across multiple demon worlds devoted to Khorne's rivals, Slaanesh, Nurgle, Tzeentch, leaving a trail of destruction that caught the attention of Khorne himself, the blood god, the lord of skulls, the embodiment of martial fury in the warp. Because nothing pleases Khorne quite like genuine, enthusiastic violence, and Tusker was delivering it in generous quantities. Then he arrived at the planet, the Flesh Planet, a world that was, literally, made of biological material, blood and muscle and bone that had been accumulated and shaped into a landscape by the power of a mighty demon prince known as the Blood Prince, one of Khorne's champions. The orcs made planetfall and found nothing waiting for them. Empty horizons of living meat, silent and still. Tusker, annoyed by the lack of immediate opposition, did the thing that best expressed his character. He shot the ground. The ground shook. He looked at his boys. He looked at the ground. He raised his shooter again and yelled what might be the most perfectly orc command in all of orc history. He told his warriors to fire everything, all of it, at the ground, right now, and the ground erupted with bloodletters. What followed was the greatest fight of Tusker's life, by any measure. Mr. Blood Prince himself rose to challenge the war boss directly, and the two of them fought for hours while the battle raged around them. Orcs and demons locked in furious combat across the breathing, living surface of the flesh world. Tusker was wounded repeatedly. His boys fell in their hundreds, then their thousands. The Blood Prince was everything a champion of Khorne should be. Massive, furious, impossibly strong, with weapons that sang with the accumulated murder of millennia. It ended when the Blood Prince drove a blade through Tusker's gut and pinned him to the ground. His weird boys managed one last act. They distracted the demon long enough for Tusker to drive the power claw upward between its legs, impaling his enemy even as he bled out. A mutual kill, perhaps. A final act of violence that was, in its way, was a complete and perfect expression of everything Tusker had ever wanted from life. Tusker died, and then Khorne intervened. The blood god had been watching, not with anger, exactly. Khorne is complex in the specific way that a god of war can be complex, because he respects the act of battle genuinely, regardless of who performs it or for whose benefit. He had watched Tusker's horde charge into his domain, looking for the best fight available. He had watched them fight and die without hesitation or complaint. He had watched them deliver exactly the kind of unlimited, enthusiastic, carnage-generating warfare that is, in Khorne's cosmology, the highest possible expression of existence. He was pleased. The blood god resurrected Tusker's warband. Not just Tusker, not just the leaders. Every orc who had died on that flesh world was restored to life with the dawn of the next day, and Khorne placed them before his brass citadel, the fortress at the heart of his domain in the realm of chaos, the most holy and fortified location in the blood god's territory, and sent his bloodletter generals out to fight them. Every day, the orcs fight, the orcs die. The spores of their deaths take root in the blood-stained soil of the foothills outside the brass citadel, growing in the weird and accelerated time of the warp, producing new orcs that are born into the fight and die in it, and begin again with the next dawn. And here is the extraordinary thing, the defining thing, the thing that makes Tusker's story perhaps the most philosophically perfect orc story ever told. He was loving it. For Tusker, this was not a hell. Thus, this was not a trap. This was not a punishment cleverly disguised as paradise. This was genuinely the thing he had always wanted, an enemy that never ran out, a fight that never ended, a cycle of battle and death and rebirth and battle again, forever in the company of his boys, against opponents who kept coming because a god was personally ensuring they would. There is a note in various lore discussions about the long-term implications of Tusker's situation, and it's one of the most satisfying details in all of orc fiction. Orcs grow larger and stronger from fighting. This is a documented biological fact. The experience of battle stimulates orc growth, and victory stimulates it most of all. Tusker's warband has been fighting continuously, day after day, in the warp itself, which is a temporal and physical environment that defies conventional measurement. How long have they been there? Decades, certainly. Perhaps centuries, and the entire time they have been in constant combat, growing larger, growing stronger, cycling through death and rebirth and death again with every new day. The speculation in various corners of the lore community, and it is speculation, let's be clear, not confirmed canon, is that Tusker's warband might, after all this time, be growing towards something resembling the ancient Krork. That the constant fighting, the constant growth, the strange time-warping environment of the warp might be slowly but steadily returning them toward the 12-meter giants that the Old Ones originally engineered. And that the day might come when Khorne's entertainment becomes something he can no longer control, when his great daily fight against a novelty opponent becomes the worst mistake the blood god ever made. Whether or not that will happen, Tusker's story answers something important about our central question. It demonstrates that for an orc, death is not the end of the fight. It may not even be the end of the same fight. The orc mentality, the absolute, complete refusal to accept that things are going badly, the certainty that victory is available, the genuine pleasure in the act of combat regardless of outcome, is not disrupted by death. It continues through it. Tusker died and kept fighting. His boys died and kept fighting. The fight is the point. The fight always was the point. Death, in this context, is just another obstacle. Section 8. When an orc refuses to accept death, belief, the warp, and the question of persistence. Now we are getting to the heart of it. We have established that orc bodies are extraordinarily difficult to destroy. We have established that when they are destroyed, the spores they release continue the biological legacy. We have established that orc belief has genuine physical consequences through the Gestalt field. We have established that orc spiritual identity, in the framework of warp metaphysics, goes to the Great Green and may be reincarnated. We have seen in Tusker the most extreme example of orc identity persisting through and beyond death. Now let's ask the question directly. In a universe where an orc's belief can make a red vehicle go faster, can make yellow explosions bigger, and can sustain entire gods in the warp, what happens to an orc who is technically dead, but who has not, at any level of its consciousness, accepted that? The honest answer is that the lore doesn't give us a single clean, definitive scene. There is no codex entry titled "The Mechanics of Orc Refusal to Die," but the pieces are there, and they fit together into something coherent. Consider the cognitive quirk that xenobiologists have noted in orc psychology. orcs do not seem to experience cognitive dissonance in the way other species do. Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort that arises when a mind holds two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. Most minds resolve it by discarding or modifying one of the beliefs until they are no longer in conflict. But orcs seem to be immune to this process. As the truck that definitely had no fuel continues to run, the gun with no ammunition continues to fire. The orc that should, by any rational assessment, be dead continues to fight. And the orc does not experience any psychological friction from this contradiction. It simply continues. This is almost certainly another gift from the Old One's engineering, for creatures designed to maintain function in the chaos of the most extreme warfare imaginable. The ability to simply continue regardless of contradicting evidence was probably a survival advantage. The orc that pauses to reconcile the fact that its internal organs appear to be on the outside with the tactical requirements of the current moment is less effective than the orc that processes the external sensation, notes that something has happened, and continues to charge while its fungal biology frantically reassembles what needs reassembling. But this immunity to cognitive dissonance has a fascinating extension. If an orc genuinely, at the deepest instinctive level, cannot accept the input that it is dead, because the very architecture of its mind is designed to dismiss contradicting evidence in favor of the current program, and the current program is fight, then the death signal doesn't fully propagate. The physical systems shut down, but the psychic component, the soul, the orc essence, that the Gestalt field both expresses and sustains, continues to operate on the assumption that this is a temporary setback. And in the warp, which is a place where consciousness shapes reality and persistent psychic assertion has physical weight, as a soul that refuses to accept its own death is a soul that is not fully dead. It is a soul with unfinished business, with an unresolved program running, with an expectation that has not been fulfilled. What does that look like? It is worth considering what the warp already knows about persistent consciousness refusing dissolution. Ghosts, in various 40k lore traditions, are understood as psychic imprints, the echo of a powerful personality preserved in the warp or in the physical world by the strength of an emotion at the moment of death. Hate, love, grief, obsession, these strong emotions leave marks. The stronger the consciousness, the stronger the emotion, the more persistent the imprint. An orc that dies in the full white heat of battle, completely absorbed in the act of fighting, is experiencing nothing but the pure focused intensity of combat at its most physical and immediate. The orc is not dying in a state of gentle acceptance or emotional resolution. It is dying in a state of absolute conviction that the fight is ongoing and will be won. The psychic imprint of that death is, potentially, one of the most persistent things in the warp. Not because orcs are particularly sophisticated psychically, but because the single-minded clarity of their state of mind at the moment of death is of an intensity that most species never experience at any point in their lives, let alone at their ends. This may be part of why the orc gods are so enduring. Every orc death adds to the collective, adds its psychic energy, its conviction, its stored experience of violence and victory, to the great green, to the field, to Gork and Mork. The gods of the orcs are not sustained by quiet devotion, by morning prayers, by careful ritual maintenance. They are sustained by the most explosive psychic events in the lives of their believers. The deaths of warriors who died still fighting, still certain, still completely unaware that they should have stopped. 60 million years of that. 60 million years of orcs dying with the full, brilliant, terrifying conviction that they were winning, and each death adding its energy to the collective. The field, the great green, the twin gods have been fueled by this for longer than most species have existed. When we ask, what happens when an orc dies and doesn't believe it, the answer is not a single event. It is a spectrum. At one end is the orc body that simply keeps moving for a moment out of sheer biological inertia, its pain boy already heading over with a staple gun and a length of wire. At the other end is something like Tusker, a warband that died and came back because their combined conviction was powerful enough to attract the attention of a god and bend the rules of death itself. In between those extremes, there is probably something that happens in the warp every time an orc dies in the heat of battle. A flare of psychic energy, a burst of conviction, a small, intense pulse of absolute refusal. Most of these dissipate, absorbed into the great green, adding their small contribution to the collective. But occasionally, perhaps with particularly powerful orcs, perhaps in particular circumstances, perhaps when the collective field is running especially hot from a large congregation, some of these persist for longer than they should. Some of these flickers of continued conviction manage to stay coherent in the warp, continue to accumulate energy, continue to believe. And in the warp, continued belief is continued existence. Section 9. Khazg-Khul and the chosen of Gork and Mork. If Tusker is the most dramatic example of an orc whose death failed to stick, Khazg-Khul Mag Uruk Thraka is the most significant. He is, by any metric, the most important orc alive in the 41st millennium, the prophet of Gork and Mork, the driving force behind the largest orc military campaign seen since the War of the Beast over 10,000 years ago. As the orc that the Imperium fears above all others, not because of his size or his strength, but because of something much more unsettling. He plans. He has vision. He thinks about the past and the future in ways that ordinary orcs do not. Khazg-Khul was not always remarkable. He was a low-ranking orc boy on the world of Urk, just another member of the Horde, distinguished from his fellows only in the usual orc ways. Size, aggression, the willingness to hit things harder than the other orcs around him. Then a space marine force raided Urk, and in the chaos of that battle, a bolt round struck Khazg-Khul in the skull. Not a grazing wound, not a minor injury, a hit that destroyed approximately 30% of his skull and pulped a significant portion of his brain. He should have died. By any standard analysis of the wound, and he should have died. Instead, he was found by a pain boy, the notorious Mad Doc Grotznik, who was and remains one of the most enthusiastic and least restrained practitioners of orc medical arts in the galaxy, and rebuilt. Grotznik replaced the destroyed sections of Khazg-Khul's skull with adamantium plating. He essentially built a new cranium out of metal, plugged it in where the original bone had been, and sent his patient back into the world. Something changed. Whether it was the trauma to the brain, the replacement of biological tissue with psychically conductive metal, or some combination of the two, Khazg-Khul's latent psychic abilities present in some degree in every orc, but rarely active enough to matter, were unlocked. When he woke from the extended unconsciousness of his recovery, he woke with visions, or visions of Gork and Mork, visions of a unified orc species sweeping across the galaxy, of the Great Green made manifest, of a final war so vast and so complete that the gods themselves would tear through the barrier between warp and reality to participate. He declared himself the prophet of the gods. And he meant it absolutely. And because he meant it absolutely, and because orc belief has weight, the gods heard it. Khazg-Khul's subsequent career is the stuff of imperial nightmares. He launched 2 separate invasions of the hive world of Armageddon, each one larger and more devastating than the last. The second war for Armageddon in 941 of the 41st millennium remains one of the most destructive conflicts in the planet's history. The third war, decades later, was worse. He has fought campaigns across dozens of star systems, has gathered an armada of over 5 million ships, and is documented to be apparently present in multiple locations simultaneously, a feat that suggests something about his relationship to the warp that defies conventional understanding. And then, during what the Imperium calls the Psychic Awakening, a period of extraordinary instability in the warp that accompanied and followed the opening of the Great Rift, Khazg-Khul came to the world of Krongar. Space Wolf. Lord Ragnar Blackmane was also drawn there, both leaders pulled by forces that may or may not have been coincidental. They fought for 10 days and 10 nights, not metaphorically. 10 days of continuous direct combat between two of the most physically powerful warriors in the galaxy, each pushing through wounds that should have ended the fight long before. Gazgul's size in his current form is extraordinary even by orc standards. He has grown enormously since his early days, as orcs do when they fight and win and grow and fight again, and his current form represents decades of accumulated victory wearing the same massive body, scaled up with each new campaign. He had Ragnar pinned in his power claw, crushing the space wolf with the casual superiority of something that had simply been in more fights than his opponent. Ragnar, broken and depleted, summoned what should have been beyond his remaining capacity and drove his blade through Gazgul's neck. The warboss's head came off. Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka, the prophet of Gork and Mork, the greatest orc warlord since the Beast, and the figure around whom the largest military campaign in 10,000 years had been organized, was decapitated on the floor of an imperial cathedral on a world most of the Imperium had never heard of. And then a grot found his head. The grot, apparently acting on some instinct or simple curiosity, brought the head and the body to Mad Doc Grotsnik. And Grotsnik, the same painboy who had first rebuilt Gazgul's skull in adamantium, now reunited with his most famous patient for this singular purpose, got to work. What followed involved equipment that Grotsnik had accumulated over a lifetime of enthusiastic experimentation, procedures that would have been considered medically insane even by normal orc standards, and what eyewitnesses described as enormous sheets of green energy filling the sky above the doc's laboratory. Gazgul lived, not just lived, returned with a new body, a larger one. A body built by Grotsnik to house a consciousness that had apparently communicated with its doctor during the rebuilding process, describing the specific specifications it required going forward. Because Gazgul apparently had things to do and wasn't going to let a thing like decapitation get significantly in the way of doing them. What happened in the period between his death and his restoration? Where did Gazgul's consciousness go? The lore doesn't say with certainty, but there is a line in the novel that covers his story. Gazgul Thraka, Prophet of the Wach, by Mike Brooks, where Gazgul's severed head is described as still active, still present, still in some sense aware, even after separation from the body. And when he wakes in his new form, there is no gap in his consciousness, no missing time, no sense of having been absent. He describes receiving visions, a further revelation from Gork and Mork, a clearer picture of the Great Green and what it will take to bring it into reality. For Gazgul, dying was not an interruption, it was a conversation. This is the thing that the Imperium finds hardest to accept about the Great Orc warlords. Not their physical power, not their tactical ability, not even their numbers. It's the sense, undeniable and deeply unsettling, that these creatures are operating from a completely different relationship with mortality than any human institution has the conceptual framework to process. Gazgul was decapitated and returned with better specifications. From his perspective, this seems to have been roughly equivalent to a meeting. The grot that found his head, incidentally, was by some accounts given an unusual gift for its service. The Great Green, it seems, remembers those who serve the prophet. Section 10. The bigger picture. What orc death means for the galaxy. Let us pull back now. Let us look at the full scope of what we have been exploring. The orcs are the most widespread sentient species in the galaxy, not the Imperium of man, which has colonized over 1 million worlds. Not the Necrons, whose tombs dot star systems across every region of space. The orcs. They exist on more worlds, in more star systems, across more regions of the galaxy than any other species. They have been doing this for 60 million years. Words and their numbers are essentially incalculable. Estimates range into the trillions, and those estimates are widely acknowledged as conservative. Every one of those orcs carries the same relationship with death. Every one of them is, to some degree, the creature we have been describing, the creature whose biology argues with the concept of dying, whose psychology refuses to register defeat, whose spirit feeds into a collective that has been growing stronger since before humanity was a species, whose death releases the seeds of the next generation. The Imperium has been fighting orcs for the entire span of its existence, and the orc population has not decreased. If anything, the Imperium's own military campaigns, the Great Crusade most notably, which saw the Emperor and Horus personally lead a massive assault against the Orc Empire of the overlord Uruk at Ulanor, killing orcs by the billions, have paradoxically fed the next generation of orcs. Every death seeded a world. Every campaign that ended in the declaration of victory left behind the building blocks of the next invasion. The Imperium knows this. The solution they have developed, exterminatus, the complete sterilization of an orc-infested world, is itself telling. You cannot win against the orcs by killing them. The math doesn't work. Every orc you kill adds to the next wave. The only winning strategy is to destroy the entire biological system, the soil itself, the air itself, to remove the substrate that the spores would need to grow in. And even that is not always permanent. And if a single spore survives, if even one tiny biological package of orc genetic material drifts through space to a neighboring world or clings to a departing ship, the process starts again. The orcs do not need to survive the battle to win the war. They just need to be present long enough to die. This is the biological dimension of orc death's meaning for the galaxy, but there is a metaphysical dimension too, the collective orc psychic field, the engine that sustains Gork and Mork, that makes the Great Green a real place in the warp, that gives orc belief its physical weight grows stronger over time, not linearly, but cumulatively. Every orc that dies in battle adds its psychic energy to the collective. Every death in the absolute conviction of ongoing victory feeds the field. The field is not diminished by orc deaths, as it is enriched by them. This is why the orcs are, in some sense, the one species in the 40k setting that time is actually working in favor of. Other species are dealing with threats that actively diminish them. The Imperium is crumbling under the weight of its own bureaucracy and the endless wars it fights. The Eldar are dwindling toward extinction with each generation. The Tau are young and capable, but have yet to face the scale of threat that will test their resilience. The Orcs have been at this for 60 million years and are more numerous now than they have ever been. The Ragnarok, the Orc equivalent of a final apocalypse, a concept that exists in their mythology, is not a destruction. It is the opposite. It is the day when the orcs succeed completely, when Gazgakul unites every orc under one banner, when the Great Green pours into material reality, when Gork and Mork tear through the boundary between the warp and the physical universe to join the fight in person. The Ragnarok is the day the orcs win everything. From the orc perspective, that day is always coming. Every battle fought, every enemy defeated, every death and rebirth cycle completed is bringing them closer to it. They are not a species in decline fighting a desperate defensive action. They are a species in a perpetual, joyful offensive, sustained by gods they themselves created, fueled by deaths that feed the next generation, driven by a belief so powerful that it has bent reality around it for 60 million years. When you understand all of this, when you see the full picture of what orc death is and what it isn't, the question we started with takes on its full weight. What happens when an orc dies and doesn't believe it? The answer, in its simplest form, is it keeps going. In its body, if the body is still capable. In the spores it releases, which will grow into new orcs that inherit something of its genetic legacy. In the Great Green, where its spirit contributes to the collective and may be returned to a new body when Gork and Mork see fit. In the collective psychic field, which grows incrementally stronger with each edition. In stories, because orcs have stories told by the Runthards, passed down through generations of the great fighters and the great fights. And a warrior who keeps fighting after it should have stopped is exactly the kind of story that orcs tell with the most enthusiasm. And in the most extreme cases, Tusker, Gazgakul, in an actual continued existence in some form, sustained by the specific and particular power of a belief so complete and so uncompromising that the universe simply couldn't argue with it. The orc attitude toward death is not recklessness. It is not stupidity. It is the completely rational behavior of a species that, at the deepest possible level, has determined that fighting is better than not fighting, and that death is only a problem if you let it be one. It is a species that has stared at the concept of mortality for 60 million years and responded with genuine puzzlement at what everyone else is so worried about. We will all, at some point, encounter something we cannot keep going through. The orc response to that moment is simply to not have that encounter, to be so thoroughly committed to the ongoing act of existing and fighting that the concept of stopping simply fails to gain purchase. There is something almost zen about it, if you approach it from the right angle. The orc in the middle of a fight is the most present thing in the universe. Absolutely, totally, completely in the moment. Experiencing what it was made to experience, doing what it was made to do, contributing to a collective that stretches back 60 million years and forward into a prophesied apocalypse that is also a kind of heaven. It has no anxiety about tomorrow, no regret about yesterday. It is entirely where it is, and when it dies, it doesn't notice. Not really. The fight goes on, while it always does. Section 11. The Makari Paradox. Reincarnation in action. There is one more piece of this story that deserves its own time. One more name to invoke. One more piece of lore that demonstrates, in miniature, what orc death and orc afterlife look like when they are working as intended. Makari. Makari is a grot, one of the smaller, weaker, but sharper-minded members of the orcoid family. Gretchen are not orcs. They are a related species that functions as servants, labourers, and cannon fodder in orc society. They are generally regarded by orcs as annoying, useful, and expendable in roughly that order. Makari is different. Makari is the banner-bearer of Khazg-Khul Thraka, the personal attendant to the prophet of Gork and Mork, and has held this position through more campaigns, more battles, and more years than any other grot in history. Because Makari, the lore strongly implies, has been reincarnated multiple times. When one Makari dies, and given its proximity to Khazg-Khul, Makari dies fairly regularly, a new one is eventually found, bearing enough resemblance and enough of the inexplicable quality that first drew Khazg-Khul's attention to declare that yes, this is still Makari. Khazg-Khul himself appears to believe this. He has referred to Makari's deaths and returns with an equanimity that suggests this is not an unusual occurrence, but a confirmed pattern. The spirit of his banner-bearer passes through the Great Green and returns, because Gork and Mork apparently consider the position of Khazg-Khul's banner-bearer important enough to ensure its continuity. As there is even a note in certain versions of the lore about a dark comedy element. Makari consistently seems to commit suicide upon being reborn. Specifically, whenever a new Makari is identified and brought to Khazg-Khul, the grot in question appears to immediately attempt to end its new life upon realizing the nature of the assignment. The implication that being the personal banner-bearer of the most dangerous and battle-seeking orc in the galaxy is sufficiently terrifying even to a being that has apparently already experienced dying multiple times, is one of those perfect 40k moments where the darkly comedic and the genuinely unsettling occupy exactly the same space. But Makari's story illustrates something important about the orc reincarnation system. It is not random, as it is not simply the great green dumping spirits back into the nearest available body and hoping for the best. There appears to be continuity of identity, continuity of role, continuity of relationship. Makari is still Makari across multiple lifetimes. Something essential persists through the death and the great green and the return. This is remarkable in the context of the broader Warhammer 40,000 universe. For humans, reincarnation is either non-existent or deeply uncertain. The soul goes to the warp, and what happens there is largely beyond human influence or understanding. For the Eldar, The soul must be carefully preserved in a spirit stone or risk being consumed by Slanesh. For the Necrons, continuity of identity is maintained through mechanical replication of consciousness. Yeah, but many of them have suffered such severe memory corruption that the identity that persists is degraded and damaged almost beyond recognition. The Orcs have a reincarnation system that, within the specific framework of their collective belief and the Great Green, appears to work. The identity persists. The soul, such as it is in an Orc, comes back. And it comes back to the same context, the same relationships, the same ongoing story. Because the Great Green is not a place of forgetfulness, but a waiting room that preserves what matters. What matters to an Orc, of course, is the fight and the companions you fight alongside. So the Great Green preserves exactly what an Orc would want preserved: the sense of self, the connection to its fellows, the readiness for the next round. To strip away the complexity of human spiritual anxiety, and what you get is actually quite elegant. The Orc doesn't need to be preserved in its entirety. It just needs enough to be recognizably itself when it comes back. And an Orc is, at its core, not complicated. An Orc is its enthusiasm, its combative identity, its specific flavor of aggression. Preserve those things, and you have preserved the Orc. The Great Green preserves those things and sends them back. This is the final piece of the answer to our question. When an Orc dies and doesn't believe it, the full sequence is something like this. The body keeps going for as long as biology permits, driven by the Orc's absolute refusal to register the situation as a crisis. The spores release at the moment of biological death, seeding the ground for the next generation. The spirit, was saturated with the conviction of ongoing battle, carries that conviction into the Great Green, arrives hot with the energy of whatever it was doing when it died, and adds that energy to the collective. It waits in the Great Green in the company of its gods, who are the expression of everything it was and believed and fought for. And when the time comes, it returns. The Orc was right all along. Death was not the end. It was just a transition between rounds. Section 12. What this means and why it matters. There are species in Warhammer 40,000 that have achieved genuine immortality. The Necrons are housed in bodies that do not age and do not die of natural causes, though they can be destroyed. The Citan were beings of such immense power that they functionally existed beyond death in any conventional sense, who even the Chaos Gods are, in principle, immortal, sustained by the emotional output of conscious beings across the galaxy, unable to truly die as long as those emotions persist. The Orcs are not immortal in any of these ways. Individual Orcs die. Individual spirits do not persist forever. The cycle does not guarantee that any specific Orc keeps existing indefinitely, but what the Orcs have achieved is something different and in some ways more profound. They have achieved collective immortality. The species continues, the field grows, the gods persist, the Great Green waits. And through the mechanism of spore reproduction and spiritual reincarnation, what the Orcs are, what makes them Orcs, that specific quality of joyful, unconquerable, as completely unself-conscious enthusiasm for the act of existing and fighting, is preserved and perpetuated regardless of any individual loss. This is why, despite the scale of losses Orcs have suffered across every war in recorded history, the species is more numerous today than it has ever been. The War of the Beast, when Orc forces were powerful enough to strike at Terra itself and nearly end the Imperium, ended in Imperial victory. But the Orcs did not disappear. They dispersed, grew, and eventually reached numbers that dwarf what they had during the War of the Beast. Every Imperial crusade against the Orcs has, in the long run, fed them. Every battle where Orcs die in their millions has scattered spores across thousands of worlds. The Imperium has been unintentionally nurturing its most indestructible enemy since its founding. And in the Warp, every one of those deaths has added to the Great Green. Every Orc that died convinced it was winning added its conviction to the collective. Every war boss who went down swinging added its leadership, its aggression, its specific flavor of orky determination to the pool that will eventually be drawn upon to produce the next generation of leaders. There is something in this that is almost hopeful by 40,000 standards. Not hopeful in the way that human stories are hopeful. Orc victory is, for every other species in the galaxy, a catastrophe, but hopeful in the sense that it describes a relationship with existence that is free of the existential dread that haunts every other species in the setting. The humans of the Imperium live in constant fear of the warp, of chaos, of the slow death of their civilization, and of heresy from within and invasion from without. The Eldar carry the knowledge of their own decline, the awareness that every death diminishes a species that cannot afford to be diminished, the constant psychic shadow of Slaaneş's hunger. The Necrons are trapped in metal bodies that preserve their form, but erode their identities, waking from their long sleep to find that much of what they were has been lost. Even the Chaos Gods are defined by their specific neuroses. Tzeentch's compulsive scheming, Nurgle's tender embracement of decay, Slaaneş's insatiable hunger, Khorne's bloodlust. The Orcs are anxious about nothing. They are afraid of nothing. They face death with the same cheerful ferocity they face everything else. And because they have, whether by Old One design or by their own 6 million year evolution into this attitude, arrived at a relationship with their own mortality that is functionally indistinguishable from peace. They do not fear death because death does not mean what it means for other species. The body might stop, the spirit moves on, the spores feed the next generation. The collective grows stronger. The gods endure. And the fight, the beautiful, endlessly renewing, perpetually available, always beginning fight, goes on. It always does. Section 13. The Weird Boys and the Conduits of the Collective. Before we close completely, there is one more thread worth pulling. We have talked about the Gestalt field, about the collective, about how every orc contributes to and draws from this shared psychic resource. But there is a specific type of orc that makes this relationship visible in a way that illuminates everything else we have discussed. The Weird Boy. Every orc generates a small psychic emission, but the Weird Boys are different. They are orcs who are psychically sensitive enough to consciously experience the collective field, to feel it building around them, to be overwhelmed by it when it grows too intense. They are the lightning rods of the orc psychic system, the points where the distributed, ambient energy of thousands of fighting orcs concentrates into something visible and explosive. When a large group of orcs is in a state of high excitement, which is to say, when a large group of orcs is fighting, the combined psychic output can become so intense that it begins to overwhelm the Weird Boy at the center of it. Should the Weird Boy's eyes start to glow with green light? Strange things begin to happen in the immediate vicinity. Furniture moves, objects levitate, the air crackles with energy. And if the Weird Boy cannot find a way to release the accumulated pressure, the result is dramatic and messy. The Weird Boy's head explodes, and the accumulated psychic energy vents in a catastrophic blast that generally also destroys the heads of nearby orcs. This is considered an occupational hazard by the Weird Boys themselves, who are generally dragged onto battlefields by muscular assistants called Minders, who are responsible for pointing the Weird Boy at the enemy at the precise moment when a controlled release of the accumulated energy would be most tactically effective. Yet the Minder's job is essentially to be the aim point for a living psychic artillery piece, who would very much rather be somewhere else. What makes the Weird Boys relevant to our discussion is what they demonstrate about the nature of the collective field in the context of death. When orcs die in large numbers in a concentrated area, as happens in every significant battle, the psychic discharge of those deaths doesn't simply vanish. It adds to the field. A battlefield where thousands of orcs have died is, from a psychic perspective, a charged place, saturated with the final desperate conviction of thousands of warriors who died still fighting, still certain, still absolutely refusing to accept that this was the end. This energy is absorbed by living orcs in the vicinity, feeding back into the Gestalt, making them stronger. was more aggressive, more convinced of victory. This is why orc battles tend to escalate rather than deflate. In human warfare, heavy casualties produce demoralization, a collapse of unit cohesion, a feedback loop of fear and retreat. In orc warfare, heavy casualties produce the opposite effect. The deaths of their companions are absorbed as psychic fuel. The remaining orcs become more, not less, dangerous as their numbers decrease. The surviving orcs are carrying the accumulated conviction of the dead. Their field is running hotter, and the weird boys among them are building toward detonations of increasing power. The orc that stands on a battlefield surrounded by its fallen companions is not demoralized. It is, in the most literal psychic sense, running on the deaths of those companions. The Great Green receives those spirits. Yes, but the energy released by those deaths doesn't all go to the Great Green immediately. Some of it stays. Some of it electrifies the air and the soil and the remaining orcs, feeding back into the fight that killed the dead in the first place. This is the feedback loop at the heart of orc society. The dead feed the living die and feed the next. The Great Green receives the spirits and prepares them to come back, and every cycle of this adds a small increment of power to the collective that has been running since the Old Ones first lit the spark 60 million years ago. When an orc dies and doesn't believe it, it doesn't just benefit itself, it benefits every orc around it, every orc that will ever live, every future generation that will grow from the spores and inherit the accumulated conviction of every ancestor that came before them. The refusal to believe in death is not individual stubbornness. It is the species operating exactly as designed. The Old Ones built something extraordinary. They built a warrior species that could not be demoralized, could not be worn down, could not be convinced by any accumulation of evidence that continuing was not the right choice. They built a species where death is not a loss but a contribution, where every fallen warrior makes the next wave stronger, more capable, more certain. They built the perfect soldiers, and then they left. 60 million years ago, and the soldiers have been fighting ever since, fighting everything, including each other, because what they were made to do is what they do. And there has not been an enemy in all the galaxy's long history that has managed to convince them to stop. Section 14, closing. The beauty of the green tide and the wisdom of not caring. We started with a question that sounded ridiculous. What happens when an orc dies and doesn't believe it? And we have arrived, through biology and metaphysics and mythology and the particular flavor of cosmic dark comedy that makes Warhammer 40,000 what it is, at an answer that is considerably more interesting than the question suggested. The orc that dies and doesn't believe it is not in denial. It is not confused. It is not simply being stupid in a way that happens to look like a philosophical position. What it is doing precisely what it was designed to do by the most sophisticated biological engineers that ever existed in this galaxy, a species that built its creation to be effectively unkillable, not because it couldn't die, but because death had been incorporated into the life cycle as a feature rather than a bug. Every orc death feeds the next generation through spores. Every orc death feeds the collective through the Gestalt field. Every orc death feeds the Great Green, which holds the spirits and sends them back. Every orc death feeds the gods, who are the distilled essence of every orc that ever was. The individual dies. The species doesn't. The field doesn't. The gods don't. The conviction doesn't. And the individual, by some combination of extraordinary biology and 60 million years of accumulated spiritual momentum, but often doesn't either, not fully, not in the ways that matter. There is something in this that is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. We spend a lot of time in the 40,000 community discussing the grimdark, the horror, the despair, the scale of suffering that defines the setting. And all of that is real. The galaxy is not a kind place. Existence in the 41st millennium is, for most beings, nasty and short, and full of terrors that no amount of faith fully protects against. But the orcs have found a way through it that no other species has managed, not through power alone, though they have power in abundance. Not through faith alone, though their faith is one of the most genuine and effective forces in the setting. Through a fundamental alignment between what they are and what the universe is. The universe is violent, as the orcs love violence. The universe is full of death. The orcs have incorporated death. The universe is chaotic and unpredictable. The orcs thrive in chaos and unpredictability. The universe, in the 40k setting, runs on belief and psychic energy and the weight of conviction. The orcs have more conviction than anyone, expressed in the purest possible form, the complete, bone-deep, genetically encoded 60-million-year-old certainty that fighting is good, winning is inevitable, and nothing that has ever happened should be taken as evidence to the contrary. Death is just the universe's way of saying this particular fight is over, and the orc, characteristically, doesn't accept that the fight is ever over. There is a reason the Elder Farseer, an ancient being, one of the oldest and most sophisticated thinkers in the setting, looked at the orcs and said, "They have it figured out. They have won the great struggle. Their existence is without the existential burden that crushes the rest of us. And who are we to judge them for it? The orcs wouldn't judge you for it, honestly. They wouldn't even understand the question. They would just be over there, fighting something, growing bigger and stronger and more delightfully unconquerable, waiting for the day that Gork and Mork tear a hole in reality and come charging through to join the best fight that ever was. That day is coming. They're absolutely certain of it, and until it does, there is always something to hit, always another battle to join, always the pure and unambiguous pleasure of being exactly what you were made to be. And when they die, whether in the next 5 minutes or 500 years from now, they will go into the great green still swinging, still certain, still not quite convinced that this is really the end, because for an orc, it never is. Thank you so much for spending this time exploring the deep lore with me. If you found this journey through orc death, belief, and the extraordinary machinery the old ones left behind as genuinely compelling as I cited putting it together, please consider leaving a like on this video. It genuinely helps the channel find its way to people who care about this kind of deep exploration of the 40k universe. And if you want more of this, more quiet walks through the stranger corners of the lore, more questions that sound ridiculous until you realize they aren't, then subscribe to Caillou on 40,000 and you will always know when the next one arrives. Until then, stay curious, stay calm, and remember, if you ever feel like things are going badly, just think about Tusker, Shadow of the Brass Citadel, fighting his eternal fight in the heart of Khorne's domain, loving every second of it. He has no complaints, neither should we.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.